This is a chapter from the book My Dear Ak'i, Please Don't Be Upset, authored by Faisu Mukunana, English translation published in 2021. This book is available from Amazon.com. Millet Farming. Preparing the land. Millet, or tonu, has long been the Tsou people's staple food. When the supreme god Amo Hamo created the Tsou people on Mount Jade, he dispatched the goddess Millet, Nivunu, to distribute millet seeds and the seeds of other traditional crops to the people, and teach them how to cultivate and use them. Therefore, in traditional folklore, people treated millet with great respect. This was true for each and every stage of farming, from seeding, harvesting, and storage to consumption, because millet was so essential to the lives and welfare of the people. Millet was all the more important since the Tsou were not aware of the existence of rice until much later, when they came into contact with the Han people, the people who have emigrated to Taiwan over the past several centuries. Historically, the Tsou lived in the mountains. They had tremendous respect for nature, its power and majesty, and were humbled by how small and insignificant humans seemed in comparison. They knew that millet, that life-sustaining golden-colored grain, was a precious gift from nature and not very easy to obtain. They treated each step of the process, from preparing the land for planting to harvesting the bounty, with great care and solemnity. Traditionally, before the family elders would pick out a farming location, they would request in dreams their god's approval. If the first location didn't pass muster, the elders would pick another location, and so on, until a final approval was granted. Throughout their history, the Tsou had never used a calendar. All farming activities were instead conducted according to the seasonal cycles of nature. For example, when certain trees blossomed, it was time to perform certain farming activities. Another example, the first full moon following the budding of certain trees would mark the beginning of the farming season. The actual farming of crops, including crop selection of types of beans and grains, would be done in accordance with the subsequent stages of the moon. This same calendar-free method was followed for hunting and fishing as well. Everything had to follow nature's cycles and be in harmony with nature. This was Tsou wisdom for survival. The Tsou could be said to be the people who, for guidance in farming, looked up to the sky. In their daily lives, the Tsou people regularly looked up to the stars. Being natural astronomers, they realized how insignificant they were in comparison with nature, of which the stars, of course, were a part, which provided them with everything they needed. This resulted in a very powerful feeling, not just of respect for, but submission to nature. The notion of literally conquering nature never entered their minds. Once a location had been selected for farming millet, after the tender yellow flowers of the Taiwanese rain trees turned into red fruits and then into the color of coffee, the Tsou would walk to the proposed site armed with a variety of knives, each designed for a different task. These included thick knives to cut trees and sickle knives to cut grass and wild vines. Men and women, lined up in a row, energetically strode into a wilderness of thick grass, kudzu vines, and trees. Once the land clearing began, all one heard were the sounds of grass cutting and the louder noise of trees crashing down. One might occasionally hear faint conversations among workers who remained fairly hidden from one another by trees and the dense tangled foliage. In keeping with the Tsou's closeness to and respect for nature, a tradition that was thousands of years old, they would cultivate a piece of land just large enough to yield enough millet for their needs during the upcoming year. They would never cultivate out of greed more land than was actually needed, an approach that resulted in minimal impact upon this precious resource. Prior to burning the debris left from the trees and grass they had cut down, they would clear a swath of at least 10 feet surrounding the open plot to serve as a safety zone, so that fire wouldn't pass that zone and spread to the adjacent land. Where the land was relatively steep, the width of the swath above and below the cleared land would be made even wider. Any dried debris that could easily catch fire would be removed from the swath. Once the swath was completed, an application was filed with the local police authority for a permit allowing the farmers, on a certain date only, to torch the land. November was the best time. By then the cut trees and grass had nearly dried, and the weather was cooling down. The sweet bamboo sections utilized for water carrying were made ready in case there was an uncontrollable fire, the worst thing that could happen when torching cleared land. For this, the neighbors' assistance was needed. Everyone carried 2 long bamboo sections and distributed them along the corridor swath. Normally, the burning was done at night, so that even the smallest escaped fire could be noticed and extinguished immediately. There was this, too. The local policeman could see the fire in the dark and knew who was burning the field based on permit application records. The policemen wouldn't feel confident in heading home for bed until the entire fire was dead. The next day, the farmers would clear away any tree debris that had not completely burned. They would cut these pieces into short sticks and carry some home to use as firewood. Sowing seeds. By mid-December, activity of a different sort could be seen on the cleared field, with the family elder busy sowing millet seeds and uttering prayers at the same time. Only skilled farmers did the sowing. The less skilled might spread the seed unevenly, so that upon germination they sprouted a clump here or a clump there, preventing healthy and optimal growth over the entire field. Our millet fields normally were sited on land that was stony and had a rather steep slope, which made it difficult to use regular hoes for cultivation. No matter how far technology had progressed, it was still better to use the homemade hand adze called Tsou. This was an iron plate about 20 to 30 centimeters long and 3 to 5 centimeters wide, with one end flat and wide and the other end narrow. It also featured a hook. For this part, the farmers would search for something appropriate and ready-made. Most desirable was a hardwood branch from a tree such as an elm, guava, or tea oil camellia. A branch hook of around 40 degrees was considered ideal. It was necessary that the longer arm of the hook be small enough for a person to hold it with one hand. This arm was trimmed into a rectangular shape with a slight curvature. The iron plate was tied to the shorter arm of the hook with a long rattan string, using granny knots. We use this type of binding knot to secure a rope or line around an object. One end of the rattan string was tied to the longer arm of the hook, and the other end was pulled back to tie with this end of the rattan string once the iron plate was securely attached to the shorter arm. With the adze in one hand, a farmer could use his other hand to grasp a bunch of weeds and cut them. Just because a section of land had been burned didn't mean there weren't still weed roots in the ground. The silvergrass root, in particular, grew in huge clusters and required much force to remove. If left alone, by spring they would emerge and hinder the growth of the tiny germinating millet seedlings. After the land was torched and before the millet seeds were sowed, if there had been no rains and the cleared land remained dried and dusty, workers who had been in the field the entire day might laugh and tease one another, saying, "Ha! You look like the dark-skinned person in the toothpaste ads." At some point, when the tribal people had learned more about the continent of Africa and some of its people, they might instead say jokingly to each other, "Mr. Ambassador, which country in Africa are you from?" A typical response would be that he was from such and such country. Others who were not as knowledgeable about Africa would come up with a bogus country name and cause a big laughter among the crowd. Teasing each other like this made everyone relaxed after a long day of hard work. Still, why this particular subject area for our joking and teasing? It was because our people, compared with other tribes, tended to have a darker skin. Couple that with the dry, black dust from burning the miscanthus grass, which was stirred up by our workers' hoes and landing everywhere on our bodies, hands, face, feet, inside our clothes, and even our veiled hair. When we looked at each other, all we could see were two big eyes and bright white teeth. This, of course, closely resembled the dark-skinned person on the Darky toothpaste packages, and that was the reason why we found it so funny. Cultivating a dry land, which was usually far away from water sources, would require workers to bring their own water for drinking. What to do with dirty hands when it was lunchtime? Not much. Hygiene in the remote mountain region was beyond our control. If they carried chopsticks or spoons, workers could use those. If they forgot to bring them, they could chop a small twig and skin it or cut a section of bamboo to make instant chopsticks. Weeding. The earliest time to sow millet was in December, and the latest no later than mid-January. The timing depended on the altitude of the land and whether the slope was facing or away from the direction of the sun. Once sowed, the tiny but precious millet seeds would await the arrival of spring rains so they could then germinate and grow. Nearly invisible on the ground and covered by spring mist, the tender new green buds, full of living energy, were such a sight to behold. Once the millet had grown to about 10 centimeters in height, it was time for the first weeding. The ash left over from the wild grass fires was the best fertilizer for the young millet seedlings. Alas, it was also the best fertilizer for the weeds. Weeds always grew faster and more lustrous than millet did. Weeding on a very steeply situated and densely seeded millet farm required the climbing skills of a goat. Without such agility, one could inadvertently step on and destroy the tiny newly germinated seedlings. Worse yet, if one moved too abruptly, one could slip on the loose dirt and fall down the slope, not only damaging the tiny little plants, but also hurting him or herself. That would be a pity. It was why we often heard elder workers telling the inexperienced younger ones, "Walk carefully with light steps, with light steps. Don't step heavily like cows do." Millet fields normally required weeding 3 times per crop. Thinning was also necessary at the time of the first weeding to avoid overcrowding of the seedlings and assure a healthy growth. Wars between farmers and birds. When millet plants began to blossom, it was very important to chase away the birds because they loved millet as much as the Tsou people did themselves. When I traveled to the plains as a young mountain girl, it made me envious to see that only a few straw scarecrows, not farmers, were needed to keep birds away from the many acres of rice fields. Here in the mountains, however, the vast woods were home to many birds, and the small piece of rice field hidden nearby was what the Tsou people needed to survive. Unfortunately, their field was never hidden from the birds, for whom our crops were paradise. Therefore, for usually the months of May and June, the time rice and millet were beginning to blossom, the normally peaceful coexistence between birds and humans turned into outright warfare. After the harvest, however, that peaceful coexistence resumed, and birds and humans returned to their own daily activities, with no interference from or animosity toward one another. As the proverb says, the early bird gets the worm. In this case, the bird not only gets the worm, but the millet as well. As soon as the sky began to show its dim light in the early dawn, the birds would start to fly to the farms for their breakfast. To chase them away, farmers, like the firefighters watching over the burning fields at night, needed to rush to the farm early in the morning while it was still dark. If the birds would only prey on fully mature grains, the farmers would feel all right about sharing with them, because the birds could only eat so much before their stomachs were full. Alas, they preferred to eat the not yet mature grains, those that were still at the stage of being juicy and sweet, with white grain milk inside. Birds of all types, sparrows, white and black sparrows, flew to the farms in droves and broke into the needlehead-sized grains for the milk inside. Worse, they didn't do so grain by grain, but rather by the mouthful, while at the same time discharging feces. The speed of their destruction to millet and rice farms was beyond description. If the bird chasers relaxed their guard for just a brief moment, those so-called commando birds would dive bomb a millet farm and devour the millet grains very swiftly indeed. They seemed to actually enjoy what they were doing, happily chattering to each other, excited by not just the food, but the fun of it all. Unless they were chased away, they would stay in the field all day long, eating and playing, before finally returning to the woods for a rest. Then they would invade the millet field once again, this time before dawn. It didn't take too many days before the millet field was totally eaten up. When rice or millet ears matured, the stalks would bow under the weight of full, ripe grains. However, if not yet ripe grains were pecked by birds and therefore damaged, the stalks would remain upright, with the grains inside hollowed out. As a result, a farmer's year-long dream of enjoying a good harvest would not be realized. In traditional Tsou culture, millet was cultivated to not only feed the Tsou, but also played a critical role in their annual religious harvest festival. If a family didn't have a good harvest, they would be looked down upon and labeled as lazy people unless the poor harvest was shown to be caused by natural disasters. Birds didn't count. To chase away birds from a tiny piece of millet farm located within a vast expanse of forest was a fatiguing job, even if guarded by 3 or 4 people. The ancestors of the Tsou people came up with an idea that made use of locally available materials. They would take a section of bamboo and split it open to about 3/4 of the total length, and leave the remaining 1/4 intact. Then they'd erect the bamboo along the border of the millet farm. A rattan strap was tied to the top end of one of the halves, and the other end of the strap was pulled over and tied to a post by a worker's shack. When a worker pulled the strap and released it right away, the 2 halves of the bamboo would strike against each other and produce a big noise, po, po, loud enough to scare away the invaders. If shorter, dried bamboo halves were tied to the top of the bamboo section, the noise it produced would be even louder and more dramatic. If many such devices were erected at the middle or peripherals of the farm, it would take only one person to keep the birds at bay. The Tsou also employed a handheld bamboo device that could be carried around to chase away birds. To make this device, they would cut a piece of bamboo of 2 sections. One end of the piece was trimmed smooth so that it would be easier and more comfortable for a hand to hold. The other end of the piece was split open so that when the device struck an object, it would make a loud noise. To stay awake, a farmer ran around the millet field while carrying the device to check whether there were sneaky birds lurking around. He would yell loudly while simultaneously vibrating the device to make that po, po noise to frighten the birds. Regardless of whether it was a rice field or a millet field, when you chased birds away from your farm, they would often fly right onto neighboring fields. When that happened, it was important to notify your farmer neighbors so that they, too, could use the bird-scaring devices to loudly shoo them all away. You can imagine how much chasing and scaring was going on in the mountains during this time. During school breaks, when I was small, adults would assign me the bird-scaring chore. They said it was an easy job, that it didn't require much effort. That was definitely not the case. To be effective, you had to be fully engaged from dawn to dusk, looking out in all directions and listening all of the time. When you saw birds or heard their sounds, you needed to trigger the devices and shout out loud from the bottom of your lungs. Such a task was not trivial for a little child. Since I was small and growing, I liked to eat. I could salivate just by visualizing in my mind the wild strawberries, ripe, full, and reddish, that grew in the vicinity of the farm. I'd just go for them, leaving other things behind, no matter how important they might be. I would wake up and leave the house before dawn. Once at the farm, I was supposed to be constantly alert and, of course, constantly yelling. By noon, though, I was both tired and sleepy and couldn't help dozing off. My father knew me all too well. He would sometimes come from another farm and catch me by surprise. Noticing that I wasn't alert enough to keep the birds away, he would scold me for not doing my assigned job. Angrily, he would say to me, "You feed the birds with grains. Are you expecting to have a meal next?" Harvesting. Before the millet had matured for harvesting, we began planting yams so that the land could be fully utilized. After the millet was harvested, the yam plants continued to absorb Earth's nutrients and would provide us side crops for another year. When the golden-colored millet was ripe for harvesting, it was time to celebrate. The harvesting festival in a small village like ours was simple in scale, about the same as the festival for sowing, except here we held a bunch of golden millet stalks as part of our gratitude ceremony. Afterwards, the family elders would go to the farm to pick the best seeding grains for the next growing season. Then the entire family, with much gratitude and enthusiasm, formally began the harvest. The sickles we used to harvest millet were, naturally, made by ourselves. If necessary, we could also use scythes that normally were used for harvesting rice, though they were a little too large for millet. Everyone harvesting millet wore a rattan basket. All the fingers of the right hand, except the thumb, would hold a sickle. Using the right thumb to hold millet stalks at a point below 1 or 2 leaves, they'd push the stalks against the sickle blade and cut them. At the same time, the left hand took over the severed stalks, while the right hand, which held a sickle, removed the 1 or 2 leaves from the stalks. Using this system, the harvesters were able to cut stalks rather precisely into equal lengths, so that the severed stalks in the left hand would be about the same length. When the bundle in the left hand was large enough, the harvester would use prepared silvergrass leaves to tie the bundle together, then throw it into the rattan basket. When the basket was full of bundles, the harvester would walk to a simple shed that was used for temporary storage. There, he or she would empty the basket and return with it to the field. At the end of the day, the farmers would carry all the harvested bundles collected in the shed to their homes. The harvest season for millet was usually late June or early July, at a time when there was plenty of bright sun to dry it, since it was critical that millet be completely dry before storing. This final stage marked the end of about half a year's hard work. In the past, the Tsou people's crop storage space at home was of various types. Some farmers used thinly split bamboo strips to make huge baskets. Some used large wooden boxes, and others stored millet on a bamboo platform above a fireplace. The latter was a good option. When there was a fire in the fireplace, the heat could simultaneously keep the millet dry and prevent infestation by worms. Harvest Festival. In the large communities, either my ancestors' traditional habitation place, which nowadays is called Dabong tribe, or Tafuya tribe, celebrating the millet harvest was a solemn, complicated, and major event shared by the whole tribe. Many years ago, the entire harvest festival took about 1 month. It began with the cleansing ceremony. For 2 weeks, all participants, including those from the small communities, were supposed to refrain from eating things with a strong odor, such as fish, green onions, and leeks. They were to be solemnly respectful in what they said, as well as in their general behavior, and were required to wash themselves and their daily used objects with silvery wormwood before taking part in the ceremonies. Thoughts and actions of the participants were guided by a respectful fear of their gods. They were expected to worship with gratitude, maintain respect for all life, and adhere to established societal ethics and orders. Of course, not everything was observed in strict solemnity. While the festival proceedings were in progress, women would enthusiastically grind millet ahead of time for later ceremonial use. They would brew millet wine prior to the peak ceremonial days, and prepare gourmet food to entertain friends and relatives who would come to the festival from far and near. The taste of the first pot-cooked millet from the harvest. In those days, when there was no electricity for machines to remove husks from rice or millet, we used a mortar and pestle. It was no easy task to cook a pot of rice or millet back then like it is today. First, we judged the amount of millet needed for the meal by the amount of stalks and put them above a fireplace until the husks were crispy, thus making them easier to be removed. When we ground the husks, we had to make sure the outer shell was completely removed. Otherwise, coarse debris would remain, which was not good for eating. There were 2 kinds of millet, similar to rice, one that was sticky and one that wasn't. We used the sticky one to make millet cake. When we cooked the first pot of millet or rice from the harvesting, all of the family members would gather together. To celebrate, we would prepare more food than was actually needed. To ensure ourselves good fortune, we'd cook the first pot for dinner in an amount greater than could be consumed, so that there would be some left over, symbolic of an abundance of food for the entire year. Each time one of us would take some millet or rice out from the container, we would do it with a scoop, rather than turn the container upside down. Besides, before more rice or millet was ground, one should not use up all that remained in the container. We always left some to symbolize that there would be no shortage of grain. So when we tasted that first meal from the new harvest, after nearly 1 year of hard labor, not only did we enjoy it with happiness and much respect and gratitude, but also with a solemn attitude. Ah, the aroma of freshly cooked millet permeating the air, becoming part of mind and body and shared by my family and me. This feeling, these sensations, even today I still remember vividly.